Hello, Saints. This is Lecture 9, introducing Week 5. And in Week 5, as you know from the syllabus, there are some choices in terms of readings. If you can find these books, or one or several of them, locally, please feel free to use them. Otherwise, if you would do the reading in Friend, you can respond to question number 1 on the syllabus for Week 5. The topic for this week in general is Christianity in the late 3rd century. That is, just before the great persecution of 304 to 311, and also just before the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, and all that that meant in terms of Christianity's status in the Roman Empire. Rodney Stark, whom you've run across before, calculates that numbers of Christians rose from about 1 million in 250 AD to about 7 million in 300 AD. So that Christianity represented perhaps 10% of the population of the Roman Empire by 300 and was poised to become much larger in ways that we will see when we begin to look at the 300s. So before that great giant stair step in Christian numbers and Christian influence throughout the Roman Empire, let's pause a bit and look at Christian life in the late 200s AD. As you will have gathered, the 50 years from 200 to 300, 250 to 300, were a period of great growth in the Christian movement, which raises the question, how did Christian communities grow? First of all, when you think of Christianity in the late 3rd century, we still need to be thinking about Christians meeting in small house churches. Maybe dozens of these house churches in a large city like Rome or Carthage or Ephesus. In a small rural village, perhaps just one of these house churches that could accommodate anywhere from 12 to 60 persons. So we're still talking pretty small gatherings. Now, in the 230s, in places where it was politically possible to do this, Christians are, so to speak, coming out into the marketplace and beginning to design spaces, not whole buildings yet, but specifically designated rooms, for example, for Christian worship. In the sands of what's now Syria on the border of Iraq was a town called Dura Europos, where in the 230s Christians seem to have decorated and furnished a specific room set aside solely for worship. That's the first such that we know of. Otherwise, we should be thinking of Christians gathering in relatively small groups, 60 max, for their worship and their fellowship. But how did they add to their numbers? Well, as you can imagine, in a situation where persecution was possible at any time, if the emperor took it into his mind that this would be helpful, it could happen. Or if a local emergency, a local disaster occurred that required a scapegoat, the Roman authorities would wink at mob violence against Christians in the 200s still. So there could be no public campaigns, no Billy Graham campaigns. The only public events that Christians participated in were martyrdoms, which were very public. Worship was closed. That is to say, senior catechumens, people who were on the verge of being baptized but were still technically pagans, could attend the first half of worship, the so-called liturgy of the word, but the liturgy of the table, our Lord's Supper, was still closed to outsiders in the mid-3rd century. So no public campaigns, closed worship, the occasional martyrdom, as you know. I think we spoke of Perpetua and Felicitas in Carthage in 202 under the Emperor Septimius Severus, when a group of Christians were swept up in a local pogrom and executed in the arena there outside the city of Carthage. That sort of event often had a powerful effect on eyewitnesses, and people could be converted on the spot and later seek out secret Christians to follow up on their conversion. But this was the only public event that Christians could participate in. In the cities, remember that the apartment block was the typical unit of human habitation, 4, 5, 6 stories high, timber frame, always likely to fall down, mud and wattle covering, plastered with stucco, very fragile. The apartment block in most cities was the almost invariable unit of human habitation. The wealthy had urban compounds. Perhaps 5% of the buildings, the residential buildings in a city like Rome, would be the urban compounds of the very wealthy. These would be stone on the outside, very narrow windows, mostly for defensive purposes, built around an internal courtyard, often with a goldfish pond and a fountain in the middle. These were the urban residences of the very rich, who would typically have much grander estates in the countryside, where they ran their estates with gangs of slaves. For most Christians, then, the community was a small group of 6 to 12 meeting in a one-room apartment in one of these islands, or insulae, as the apartment blocks were called. And the point of contact, of course, with the pagan world was everywhere else. The artisan workshop, the butcher shop, or the bakery where they worked. Or in the case of the wealthier Christians, who were becoming more numerous in the mid-200s, the women's quarters in the urban fortress would be the point at which evangelization could happen, where women lived close together, and servants were often on very familiar terms with their mistresses and could share the gospel there. One of the foremost historians of the early church, Ramsay MacMullen, wrote a book called The Christianization of the Roman Empire, in which, on the basis of a lifetime study of the spread of the Christian movement in the early few centuries, said that he thought the most frequently occurring point of evangelization in the Roman Empire was something like this. Somebody gets sick. Let's imagine that it's a wealthy Roman administrator living in an urban fortress. Call him Marcus and his wife Julia. Marcus gets sick. They call the doctors. Medical care before the late 19th century tended to be lethal, as you probably know, and so the doctors are able to do nothing. And so they don't know where to turn. Julia has a little servant girl called Daphne. you can think of biblical echoes here. The Naaman the Syrian and his wife's little Hebrew servant girl. Anyway, Daphne says to Julia, I know some people, they come, if you like, and pray to their God for sick people and lay hands on them, and amazing things have happened. And so by this time, Julia is beside herself and she'll try anything. And so Daphne gets word to the elders of the little house church she attends in a nearby apartment block. And the next day, 3 working men in labor-stained smocks show up at this very wealthy estate, urban estate, and they gather around Marcus' sickbed, lay hands on him, and pray to the one high God who created the heavens and the earth, who is the sole sovereign of the universe, all which sounds very strange to Marcus and Julia because they're, of course, polytheists. They believe in all the Roman gods and then some. The workmen pray to the one high God, lay hands on Marcus, and his fever breaks. And he begins to get well, and he sits up and takes some nourishment. And after a day or so, when he's well enough to put 2 thoughts together, he says, "What was that?" And Julia calls Daphne, and Marcus says to the little serving girl, "What happened?" And Daphne says, "Well, the one high God, when you call on his name and ask him to be present, well, always something happens, and it's usually really good." And so Marcus says, "Golly, I need to know more about this. This is something I've never, ever experienced in my entire life before this." And so Daphne says, "Well, I can take you to some people who know this one high God and pray to him every day. And besides, they not only are channels of his power, but they can teach us to live in such a way that when the last judgment comes, we'll be spared." Now, Romans technically didn't believe in a second coming or a last judgment, but deep within the consciousness of most Roman educated people, there was a sense of shame about the human condition, that simply by being made up of matter, they were dirty and somehow depraved. So the idea of a reckoning, of an accountability at some point, either in the body or out, wasn't so very strange to Romans. And so Daphne arranges to have Marcus come to the little house church in the apartment block the next morning at 5 o'clock before dawn, where people who are studying to become Christians meet and learn about the stories of the faith and about the values and the lifestyle of Christians from laborers and fishwives and weavers and women who run bakeries, all very working class people. And Marcus isn't entirely sure that he, A, will trust his body to the apartment block that's likely to fall down at any moment, or his reputation to the company of these very blue-collar, we would say, lower-class, working-class people. But the attraction is so great that he actually takes a deep breath the next morning and goes out with Daphne, accompanied by 3 stalwart bodyguards, because the streets at night are very, very dangerous, carrying torches, and they make their way to the apartment block. And Marcus submits, as John Wesley would say later on, about field preaching, Marcus submits to be more vile and actually agrees to undergo this long, long process of catechesis that in due course adds Marcus, Julia, and their entire household to the company of Christians in the Roman Empire. So this is one way that cumulative growth took place over the 200s, leading to a large movement of 7 million plus by the year 300. During this period, it may well have been that the attraction of the Christian movement was enhanced by the disasters that were occurring in the Roman Empire. As I think you know, between the year 235 and the year 284, there were something like 29 different emperors. That is, the political system in the Roman Empire fell apart. Armies would put up their general as emperor, and rival armies would respond by putting up their general as emperor, and the two armies would clash, and meanwhile the borders collapsed, and all sorts of barbarians came in and ravaged the empire across the Rhine frontier, for example, or in places simply seceded from the empire. You know, Palmyra in the Syrian desert has been in the news lately because of ISIS destroying monuments there. It was a great trading city in the 260s, ruled by Queen Zenobia. And Zenobia seceded from the Roman Empire and declared the independence of her kingdom or queendom, and actually got away with it for several years. It wasn't until 284 that a brilliant general called Diocletian managed to pull the empire together again, stabilize the frontiers, begin to deal with the damage that had been inflicted by almost 50 years of chaos in the empire, and did so by essentially enlisting every inhabitant of the Roman Empire into the Roman army. That is to say, everyone had a job to do to keep the Roman army strong, farming or raising cattle or doing whatever was required, keeping up the roads, doing civil service projects to make the Roman army possible. All of this militarized the Roman Empire and was seen as necessary at the time. And so after 284, the Roman Empire began to settle down a bit, but the near collapse of the empire had been an awful shock to the inhabitants. And the old worldview that said the gods have favored the empire, that is, the one high God infinitely distant from the universe, and the subordinate gods, each of whom was identified with an astral body like the sun or the moon or the 5 then known planets. The gods had looked with favor on the Roman Empire, had given the Roman emperors a dollop of genius to enable them to rule this vast 70 million conglomerate of different races and tongues. The story that the gods favored the Roman Empire had become rather threadbare after 29 emperors and 50 years of chaos. And so this 50-year disaster in the history of the empire may well have enhanced the attractiveness of the Christian movement, but of course it was still, as it were, underground. Well, it wasn't underground, it was 4 stories up in an apartment building, meeting at 5 in the morning every day, and of course at 5 on Sunday. This was because the workday started early and people had to do their worship and their study before all that began. So that's what was going on around the Christians in the period from 235 to 284. Ordinary Christians in this period, well, continued to be a center of gravity, at least, of the Christian movement, continued to be in the artisan class. I remember visiting a church in Carthage, which is now in the city of Tunis in Tunisia, which was, of course, in ruins, but it had been built on the site of the ceramic district in Carthage, where the pottery makers gathered. And apparently in the 200s and early 300s, there was a large number of those potters who were Christians, and they became the core of what later became a parish church, once churches could be built above ground, so to speak. So the center of gravity of the Christian movement still seems to have been in the working classes, but more and more of the urban rich, both the mercantile class, the merchants, think back in the first century of Lydia of Philippi and her business in purple dye, more and more of the merchants, and indeed some Roman aristocrats, some in the governing class, like Cyprian of Carthage, who was converted about 246 and then elected Bishop of Carthage 2 years later, rather too quickly, I think, in 248. People of that level of society were being attracted to the Christian movement in greater and greater numbers. Now, there had always been aristocrats in the Christian movement. Paul talks about Christians in the emperor's household in the AD 60s, but these had always been a tiny minority. Now, Christianity, for the reasons that I've suggested, had become interesting to the Roman governing class, and greater numbers of Christians were joining it. Now, as to the countryside, the period from 250 to 300 was the period that Christianity exploded out of the cities in North Africa, what's now Tunisia, for example, in Egypt, in Palestine and Syria, and began to take root in country villages and to recruit farmers into the movement, agricultural laborers. One thinks, for example, of a young man called Antony, who lived in the Nile Valley in the 260s and 270s, was a farmer, a substantial landholder, but still living on the edge of starvation, like all peasants in the Roman Empire, became a Christian in about 270, and, well, it's a long story. He went out into the desert and became a hermit, a monk, and thereby hangs a long tale that we will get to in a week or two, the beginnings of the Christian monastic movement. But Antony was typical of the peasants in the countryside who were being attracted now to Christianity in larger and larger numbers. Amongst the rural Christians in the peasant villages, because of the desperation of their life, because the quartermasters of the Roman army after 284 were increasingly likely to seize their entire crop and leave them without any food at all for the winter to come, amongst peasants in general and Christian peasants in particular, there was a strain of radicalism that you wouldn't see so much amongst urban workers who were Christians, an apocalyptic strain, a belief in the immediate coming of our Lord, and kinds of Christianity that were high octane, that were very rigorous, like the monastic movement, like the movement out into the desert that Antony helps begin in the year 270 or so. So the countryside was a hotbed of Christian radicalism. The same was true in what's now Western Turkey, Western Asia Minor, which had been the home of the Montanist movement, you may recall, in the 160s and 170s, that belief in the coming of Christ soon to the village of Papuza in Western Turkey, which of course didn't happen, but the movement continued to be technicolor, charismatic, Pentecostal, tongues, prophecy, signs and wonders movement in the villages of Western Turkey. Another expression of the radicalism of rural Christianity. Amongst the congregations of Christians, especially in the cities, in the period from 250 to 300 or so, there are several trends that bear our notice at this time. First of all, the growing clericalization of the church. The role of the laity was diminishing liturgically. For example, instead of being able to pray spontaneously, the role of the laity was to repeat responses which were more and more standardized, as in, lift up your hearts, we lift them up unto the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is meet and right so to do. The lay participation in the Lord's Supper was being more and more formalized and restricted instead of the freedom for spontaneous prayer that we know of in the early church and continued to exist in the Montanist churches right down to the 220s and 230s. Now more and more lay people were there to have the clergy do things on their behalf. Instead of the every member ministry that we see in the early church, more and more ministers in the congregation who were not, strictly speaking, clergy, were given specific titles and were beginning to be thought of as lower, non-ordained orders of the clergy. For example, the doorkeepers, and this was a pretty significant ministry in the Roman Empire, where spies from the government were always a real possibility. So doorkeepers had to be pretty bold, probably large male Christians at this time, who would check to see that people who came in were in fact legitimate and deserved to be there. Doorkeepers. Interestingly enough, exorcists were thought of as a lay ministry, lay ministers, and were seen as one of these minor orders as well. But more and more, forming a distinct class in the church are the three orders of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Bishops now, by the 250s, receive a salary from tithe revenue to the network of Christian house churches in a given city. Not much. A mid-level administrator in the Roman government would receive about 100,000 sesterces a year. A bishop got 7. So you didn't sign up to be bishop in order to get rich, drive a Buick and have a credit card. It wasn't like that at all. The presbyters were more and more instead of standing behind the bishop at the Lord's Supper, given responsibility for house churches of their own, where they would celebrate the Eucharist on Sundays and have pastoral responsibility, directing the teachers in each little house church who would be teaching the inquirers 5 days a week, 5 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 6 days a week, and preparing them at the end of this long process of re-socialization and detox, acquiring the ideas and the habits of life that befitted a Christian. Presbyters would have responsibility for these house churches and for their process of catechesis. Deacons were, at the beginning of this period, in the 240s and 250s, generally assistants to the presbyters, who each had pastoral responsibility for a small house church. But more and more, the bishop was gathering the deacons under his aegis and under his direction as the Christian movement grew from 1 million in the empire in 250 to 7 million in 300. The financial responsibilities of a bishop grew inordinately. The Bishop of Rome, for example, was supporting 1,500 aged widows on the payroll, so to speak, in the year 250 or so. The bishop needed help, and so more and more the deacons were brought under the bishop's direction and were in charge of caring for the needy and the sick, for ransoming prisoners, which often had to be done after a pogrom or a persecution, for overseeing the other ministries of helps that the Christian communities were already famous for performing, even for pagans who were in need. Burying the dead, for example, on behalf of families who couldn't afford a decent burial and ran the risk of, what shall I say, an angry corpse and possible hauntings after that. Very important to be decently buried in the Roman Empire. This was assumed by pagans and Christians alike. Now, as part of this emergence of full-time, at least bishops were full-time by this time, in the cities at least, along with this emergence of full-time clergy leadership between 200 and 300 or so, we can see certain straws in the wind, certain indications of what will later be the direction of Christian leadership in the Latin West. Not to be exaggerated in this period, but looking back with hindsight, we can see the roots of some later phenomena already appearing in the 250s. For example, the use of the term priest to describe a presbyter, or high priest to describe a bishop. As you probably know, the word priest is never used in the New Testament to describe Christian ministers. That is the word hierus in Greek, which means someone who is a sacrificing mediator, standing between people and God or the gods. Never used of Christian ministers in the New Testament, and indeed never used for the first 150 years or so of the Christian movement. But in Carthage, in the 250s, we can see Bishop Cyprian beginning to use the word high priest to describe his own ministry, and priest to describe the ministry, the liturgical ministry at least, of the elders, the presbyters, over the local congregations. because ideas about the Lord's Supper, which would become standard in the Latin West after the 500s and 600s, had their roots in North Africa in the period 250 to 300 or so. Hitherto, the Lord's Supper had been partly an agape meal, as it seems to have been in Carthage and the Apostle Paul's time, or as the agape meal became separated from the Lord's Supper, and the Lord's Supper would be celebrated before dawn, for example, on Sunday, the first day of the week, as a standalone rite. The Lord's Supper was thought primarily to be a service of thanksgiving, as the term Eucharist implies, Eucharistia in Greek meaning thanksgiving, for the great acts of our Lord Jesus on Calvary, as Archbishop Cranmer would put it, his one full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice, oblation, and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world. The Eucharist was thought to be primarily a service of remembrance and thanksgiving for the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary. But in the 250s, we begin to see, for example, Bishop Cyprian of Carthage looking at the Eucharist as an imitation, a representation of Christ's act on Calvary, and therefore looking at the celebrant as a representative of Christ. The Latin phrase would later be used, in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. In some sense, participating in a renewal of that sacrifice that Christ had performed on the cross. So, Eucharist begins to acquire overtones of sacrifice, and therefore the celebrant begins to assume overtones of priest, of sacrificing mediator. This wasn't widespread at all in the 250s. I think because it becomes so familiar later on, we look back and see Cyprian of Carthage talking in these terms, and we say, oh yes, of course. But we fail to realize how outrageously unusual this would have been in the context of Christianity in the Roman Empire in the 250s. All of which, of course, adds to the centrality of the celebrant in the Eucharist. And the same process occurs in the matter of penance, that is, the increasing centrality of the clergy, and in particular the bishop. Penance had its roots in reconciliation to the gathered community, and it was a public act overseen by the community as a whole. In the 250s, in the case of Cyprian, we can see the bishop taking into his own hands the right to grant remission of sins and specify penance, or the process by which sinners will be reconciled to their house churches and to the larger community of Christians, in this case in Carthage. How that happened is a long story and has to do with a clash between Cyprian and the martyrs in the persecution under Decius in 249. As you probably know, Cyprian skedaddled in that first persecution. I think he was consecrated to the episcopate much, much too soon after his conversion. In any case, he left town during the persecution. And when he came back, he discovered that the people who had stayed and held fast and were in prison and about to be taken to the arena and sacrificed, that is to say, the martyrs to be, were taking responsibility for hearing confessions and assigning penance. And Cyprian had a huge battle with the martyrs as to who was responsible for this process of penitential reconciliation. And in the long run, Cyprian won. The bishop took these powers and the martyrs lost. That's a long story. But another example of the way in which, especially beginning in North Africa, we can see a clerical caste emerging in the period 250 to 300. Nothing like celibacy as a requirement yet, of course. That's really a matter for the 400s and 500s and 600s. There is some talk in the late 200s that celibacy would be a good idea for the clergy, but it is by no means accepted by the majority of the clergy. Nor do they wear, of course, a distinctive uniform, except perhaps a clean robe for celebrating the Eucharist. That's all in the future as well. Finally, we can see in this period the culmination of a long process that had probably begun in the first century, that is to say, the narrowing of women's roles in Christian leadership. In the first century, obviously, when people like Lydia and Chloe of Cenchreae and Nympha hosted churches, that is, women of substantial means with large houses, and an agape meal was celebrated, it would be obvious that it would be the matron, the woman of the household, to preside at this agape meal. Later on, this phenomenon seems to have persisted, that women were early patrons of house churches and naturally played a significant role in the pastoral leadership of those small gatherings. Women's roles were particularly prominent in the Montanist movement in the 160s and 170s and later on, because of the renewal of charismatic gifts, prophecy and tongues and interpretation. Holy Spirit was poured out on men servants and maid servants equally. Unfortunately, probably the disrepute of the Montanist movement for its exclusiveness and its claim to be the true church was harmful to women's leadership in the long run. As the Montanist movement fell into disrepute in the early 200s around the Mediterranean world, so also women's leadership took a hit in that respect as well. Likewise, the more the Christian movement appealed to the mercantile middle and governing upper classes, which assumed, of course, that the woman's role was the household, the more Christianity appealed to that stratum of society, that upper class stratum of society, the more temptation there was for the Christian movement to downplay women's leadership, which was so countercultural to the governing classes in the Roman Empire. So these are some observations then on the growth of the Christian movement from 200 to 300 or so. Was it a threat to the empire, or perhaps was it the potential salvation of the empire, politically, economically, and militarily? Well, we'll take a look at those questions in a later session.